Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Southampton English Podcasts, where staff and students at the Department of English in the University of Southampton discuss texts and approaches to studying English at A-level that will help you achieve the best results in your studies. And today, I'm here with Marianne O'Doherty, who's an Associate Professor of Medieval Literature and Culture at the University of Southampton, and Meg Rushton, who's a second-year student. And today we're going to be talking about The Wife of Bath's Prologue and Tale by Geoffrey Chaucer. So, Marianne, could you introduce yourself and tell us a bit about this tale and perhaps give us a summary of it for our listeners?
Hi, yes. I'm Marianne O'Doherty and I teach a couple of modules here at Southampton on medieval material, a module called Arthurian Worlds for second years, and a module called Chaucer in his World for second and third years. And I teach the Wife of Bath's Prologue and Tale for those modules. So it's quite a complicated text with the Wife of Bath's Prologue and Tale. You have a long prologue, which is very autobiographical, for this fictional character, this wonderful storyteller, a woman from Bath who's been married 5 times. She talks about her, in this long prologue, she talks about her philosophy and perspective on life, on husbands and how to control them. And then she talks about how she meets her 5th husband, and her story then takes quite a disturbing turn as she undergoes some experiences that we would now call emotional abuse or gaslighting, and even basically physical abuse towards the end of the story. She ends up getting beaten up by him and going deaf in one ear as a result of that. But then she also ends up fighting back, giving her husband a thump, and literally ripping up one of the books when we find out why she does that. But eventually they come to terms and make up and live happily together. So she's on the hunt for husband number 6 by the time she's on the Canterbury pilgrimage telling her story. And the tale itself that she tells on this pilgrimage has an interesting and a slightly elliptical connection to the prologue. It's basically an Arthurian story in its context. A knight of Arthur's court and the Round Table is out riding one day, sees a maiden that he likes the look of while he's out and about, and he just stops and rapes her. And no explanation is given. That's just something that happens in the story. King Arthur sentences him to death when he finds out about this. But what happens then is that Arthur's queen intercedes on the knight's behalf, begs for some mercy for him, and he is handed over to her for punishment. And she sets him a task, which is to go and find out what it is that women most desire. So off he goes on his quest to find this out, asking women everywhere what that is, to no avail. Eventually, when he's on his way back, almost having lost hope, I suppose, he spies some ladies dancing in a meadow, approaches them, presumably to ask the question, and they all disappear before he gets there, and are replaced by a hag, in the terminology of the story and scholarship, an ugly old lady, sitting on the grass. And she promises that she'll give him the answer that he needs. So he takes her back to Guinevere's court, and she does indeed provide the knight the answer, which is that women want to have sovereignty over their husbands as well as their lovers. That's what they want. They want to be in control. Mm-hmm. The Guinevere's court agrees. Yeah, absolutely. That's definitely what women want. And so the knight is freed. But then the old lady asks for her reward, because she's offered. She said in exchange for giving him the answer, she wants one request from him, and her request is, of course, that the knight marry her. The knight's extremely unhappy about this, but he has to go through with it. He has to marry the old lady. And the next thing we know, we're at the wedding night. They're about to go to bed, and the knight complains about his predicament. So in response to this, the lady then gives him a long old lesson. The old lady, she talks to him about why he shouldn't be upset. It teaches them his notions of courtesy, his ideas about nobility, because he thinks that she's sort of low class, so it's one of his objections to marrying her, are wrong, and teaches him that gentility, kind of true nobility, is in behaviour. at the end of this lesson, she offers the knight a choice. He can have her young and beautiful if he wants. That's what she says. She can be young and beautiful, but he has to take his chances that she will then be unfaithful to him if he does this. Or he can have her as she is, old and ugly. The knight has a think, and then he surrenders a choice over to her, at which point she transforms himself into the beautiful lady of his dreams and they live happily ever after. So that's our kind of plot synopsis of what goes on in the prologue and tale.
Thank you very much, Marianne. Okay, so that's what the tale is about, but we're interested in what it's like studying that at A-level and at university and how they can, I guess, those two approaches can help each other. Mm-hmm. Meg, you did the Wife of Bath's tale for A-level.
I did,
Can you tell us about that? What was it like?
So I was studying it as a part of my pre-1800 drama and poetry. So I was looking at it in comparison to a piece of drama, and in this instance it was The Rivals by Richard Brinsley Sheridan. So we were looking at kind of the satirical representation of romance, and how kind of the Wife of Bath uses scholarly sources, so like the Bible and Ovid, and manipulates them to her advantage, and sort of the use of her rhetoric and how she convinces the summoner, etc., etc. Yeah. So we did definitely focus on the Wife of Bath as a figure more than the tale. Yeah. And the use of kind of the rise of sentimentalism in The Rivals really kind of like acted as a foil for that. It was really, really interesting. So yeah, it was definitely perplexing.
Perplexing.
To say the least. I think the story arc of the tale completely, from a modern perspective anyway, did not give the satisfaction. You know, there was no sort of like sin redemption kind of with punishment in the middle. It was just sin and then some rewards. And it just didn't sit right with me at A-level. And I think I didn't really understand it, whereas now I know that Chaucer was definitely being quite wicked with the way he was representing women and romance, and actually chivalry as well.
Yes. So. Okay. So hopefully this, if you're studying this in school and you're finding it perplexing, that's fine.
Yes.
It is perplexing. But Marianne, you might be able to give us some information about the context and the form to hopefully make it less perplexing. What do you think students would need to know to get into this text?
I'm not sure that I can make it that much less perplexing, but perhaps maybe a bit more interesting and understand the reasons behind your perplexity a little bit. So I suppose I was thinking about what's important to know about context here. So I guess one context is that we need to remember that it's part of a big story collection where we've got lots of pilgrims telling one another stories, interrupting one another, and it's also unfinished. That's another thing that we need to remember. So lots of the stories, there's evidence that Chaucer changed his mind. He played about with them. He, for example, probably intended a different tale, the Shipman's Tale, to be for the Wife of Bath originally. Wow. And the Wife of Bath tale seems to maybe have been incompletely revised for the Wife of Bath, wasn't necessarily written for her initially. So it perhaps helps a little bit to kind of decouple and think about the tale and the prologue as talking to one another, but not written for one another to fit together perfectly and not completely finished. So that might help students to think about things a little bit more. Another thing to think about is perhaps in terms of context is for the prologue is the literary context of anti-feminism that Megan referred to there. Mm-hmm. So you mentioned how the Wife of Bath used authorities. You mentioned her use of authorities as being an important part of your thinking about this at A-level. Another thing that perhaps students might not necessarily know but would be helpful to know is that the Wife of Bath is an anti-feminist stereotype. Right. Lots of what she says, lots of what she does or says she's done is borrowed from this character from a book called The Romance of the Rose, the Roman de la Rose. And lots of readers, kind of knowledgeable readers, would have recognised that at the time. So they would have seen her as being an anti-feminist stereotype, whose husband, then Yankin, the man who kind of gaslights her a little bit and she ends up having a physical fight with, likes to read to her from his book about anti-feminism, about kind of what he calls his Book of Wicked Wives, basically. It's a book of stories about bad women and how they always betray men. And when she gets really angry and rips a leaf out of this book, she's an anti-feminist stereotype ripping up a book of anti-feminist stereotypes. It's really helpful to know that, I think, as you think about the prologue. And maybe in terms of the tale, there's another set of context there around the Arthurian legends, so the Knights of the Round Table, and that the idea that that's a kind of a perfect world which Chaucer begins to unpick. The idea that that knights go on quests, that they uphold chivalric values, that they protect women and the weak. All of those kind of ideas feed into the background of the tale that Chaucer tells.
Good. So Meg, you've obviously been studying all this with Marianne at university. After doing an A-level, you've come back to it.
Yep.
And in what ways have these things you've learned about the context at university informed how you understand the tale now, and might add a bit more depth to how someone is studying it at A-level?
Well, I think we definitely considered the wife of Bath as a dramatic character, and actually we didn't look at kind of the intentions of Chaucer, like you said, the sort of medieval anti-feminism of it. We instead looked at her as kind of a woman carving a space for herself with her voice, looking at how much autonomy she has over her body and things like that. Whereas actually, if you look at things like the general prologue and you look at the wider perspective of the text, Chaucer is putting a lot of layers of narration in. So not only is he creating the poem, he's a character in the poem. He's one of the pilgrims. And then through that, you've also got the wife of Bath's voice. So you've got a very sort of layered view of the wife of Bath. And yeah, actually, I don't think that the way she's portrayed is particularly flattering. Like you said, Marianne, she is an anti-feminist stereotype. I think in the general prologue, they say that she's gap-toothed. So she's branded as, so a gap-tooth is kind of like a sign of being lustful. And she's kind of branded with that, like it's the overarching thing, even though she's got all of these like rich clothes and she's on a horse, you know, she's doing really well for herself, she's still lustful, you know, there's still like an undercutting, underlying kind of tone of how
good. So this, I guess, knowing about the broader literary contexts of anti-feminist stereotypes would be really helpful to engage with this. But you also mentioned the concept of a frame narrative, and as an example of kind of concepts or terms from university English that might help. Marianne, could you tell us a bit more about how the frame narrative works in relationship to the prologue, the tale, the layers that Meg was describing there?
Yeah, so the frame narrative, that'll be, I think, perhaps a new concept for A-level listeners. And it was really new when Chaucer was using it. So the person that Chaucer may have nicked this off is an Italian called Giovanni Boccaccio, who about a couple of decades beforehand writes a book called The Decameron, where 10 ladies and gentlemen go off to a villa. It's in the time of the plague, 1348. They go off and they decide that they're going to spend 10 days each telling a story per day under someone's rule. So the idea of the frame is there is a story, an overarching story, and then within the fiction of that there is a reason given for telling some other stories, so telling of other stories. Another famous example would be the 1001 Nights from Arabic literature. And Chaucer's Canterbury Tales is an early example of this in English, and it's an incredibly dynamic structure, and that's what's really key to Chaucer's use of it. So he sets up in the general prologue all of these characters who are going to tell their stories, and you think it's going to be each character telling two stories, one on the way to Canterbury and one on the way back from Canterbury, and in previous versions of frame narratives, such as, for example, Giovanni Boccaccio, that's pretty much how it's been worked. Things have worked fairly as structured. In the Canterbury Tales, things disintegrate really rapidly into fighting, almost physical, and certain kinds of chaos. You realise that I think Chaucer has developed this structure and then starts pushing at the limits of it fairly quickly. So characters use stories to start fighting against one another. The miller and the reeve start having an argument through their stories, tit for tat. Characters fight between stories. Megan, you mentioned the summoner, the wife and the summoner and the friar. They have a big Barney at the end of the Wife of Bath's prologue. She is being interrupted, and that happens elsewhere. And Chaucer also breaks the frame by halfway through the narrative having a whole new character ride up, the canon's yeoman, ride up and join the group. So he's not even in the general prologue, and he turns up and then he has a tale. So this becomes a really, really dynamic frame in Chaucer, something that is not fixed. It's not a shell in which things are fixed. It's a sort of a mechanism for taking ideas in different directions and putting voices, I would say, ideas and perspectives in dialogue with one another.
Right. Yeah. So, Meg, you've been studying The Wife of Bath's Tale at university.
Yep.
With Marianne. Are there any particular essays or approaches that you found useful that you might want to recommend? And how have they shaped your interpretations?
I think in a meeting we had, because I've recently done an essay on this, we were talking about, now I'm going to butcher this name, Alcuin Blamires, is that his name?
Alcuin Blamires, yeah.
Blamires.
Yeah.
He's super cool. He talks about kind of like women just in medieval texts in general.
Yeah.
So what I found at A-level quite useful was to find a kind of general quotation about, say, the era, or what the what the tropes were of the texts at the time, and then interrogate that in an essay.
Yeah.
So you're not just sort of slipping something in
Good.
for the sake of it. You're definitely interrogating it. So he's really cool.
Yeah.
Also, I like looking at things like feminism and gender, and kind of how our modern perspective of a text would influence a reading versus, like Marianne said, the medieval anti-feminism.
Yeah.
I think in terms of sources, the Middle English Dictionary is really good.
Right.
I don't know whether people are reading it like in translation or whether in Middle English, but being aware of the Middle English and actually looking at some of the words. So in the tale, the knight calls the queen a sovereign, and if you look up sovereign, it actually means an agreement, a government.
Oh.
Whereas the hag calls the queen a liege, so there's kind of like a lord and retainer relationship.
Wow.
So there's definitely kind of pragmatic uses of Middle English words, which is really interesting. There's lots of different things. Definitely read the footnotes and the introductions, which I was very guilty of not doing.
Right.
Because without footnotes, I wouldn't have known that gap-toothed meant lusty, and that is so key to your reading of the text.
Yeah.
And introductions are just really accessible ways of getting a critical perspective of the text.
Yeah.
Because reading Middle English, especially for the first time, even now as a university student, is really daunting. So having someone to sort of take you by the hand and lead you through the text with the introduction and keeping referring back to it as well is really interesting.
Good. And if, like me, you find Blamires difficult to figure out how it might be spelled, or you're interested in the Middle English Dictionary online, there is a bibliography of all the texts and sources that we reference on this podcast at the bottom of the webpage. So don't worry, just go back to the main page and click at the bottom, and you'll find a list of these. Marianne is going to helpfully do them. Thank you. All right. Now, you... At A-level, Meg, you did this in a comparative text approach, so you compared it to another text. What did you did with Sheridan?
Yeah.
Yes. How did you find kind of putting it together with another text, and what advice would you have for people trying to do that?
I think it was definitely challenging because they were from two very different eras.
Yeah.
The comparison wasn't explicit. It was more thematic. So you could look at kind of satire and how characters are represented as quite trivial. So the wife of Bath is represented in that way. Whether she's seen as sort of wily by manipulating these sources, or whether she's seen as uneducated, and I think in the same vein, Sheridan was representing kind of sentimentalism and this idea of like the circulation libraries in a really kind of trivial way, and actually it was kind of a rise of affect, really, and it's actually really key to how we view like the human condition. So actually it's not trivial at all. So yeah, I think thematic was kind of key to that, and genre as well. I think we were comparing to kind of like restoration comedies to like the Breton lay,
right? Wow.
And how that was linked, but I can't really remember that too well. I just remember that in my head like sentimental comedy and Breton lay as terms. In terms of other texts, which I looked up because there was kind of a list of prose and a list of dramas, list of poetry and dramas, sorry. There was Webster's White Devil, which I read over the summer, actually. So I was like, ooh. And it was, I thought that was quite an interesting comparison, Wife of Bath and White Devil. And also 'Tis a Pity She's a Whore, which I haven't read, but I think, you can kind of see the link there.
Yes, yeah.
So yeah, there were definitely some really interesting plays to link it to.
Yeah. And Marianne, you had a couple of suggestions of perhaps comparative texts that a student might look at, and you have a suggestion of what kind of themes that you might be able to make the connections about.
I found this quite tricky to think about, surprisingly difficult to think about actually, but I did have a few ideas, yeah. I wondered about whether the tale of the prologue do diverge a little bit here. I think you maybe get different, that you'd work better with different comparators for each one. I did wonder whether the Winter's Tale might be an interesting comparator for the Wife of Bath's Tale, because of the sort of, I guess, although as you said, it doesn't quite work so well, the kind of crisis, kind of movement away or loss, and then restitution at the end, happily ever after, and slightly unexplained, slightly otherworldly ending at the Winter's Tale. I thought that might be an interesting comparator there. And a woman unjustly accused of adultery, so they kind of think about feminism as a way into that. Among Arthurian texts to compare to the Wife of Bath's Tale, I think it would be really interesting to look at Tennyson, who and really quite a few of his Idylls of the King poems when he goes back to the Arthurian legends and uses it to think about his own time, because the Wife of Bath's Tale is using the Arthurian world to think about Chaucer's own world. That's absolutely what's happening in the ladies' lesson, the enchantress, as I like to call her, or hag's lesson. So anything that uses the Arthurian world to think about the now would be a good comparator for the Wife of Bath's Tale. For the prologue, I just think you couldn't do better, really, than another fictional autobiography that plays about with contemporary stereotypes. Bridget Jones's Diary. I really think it would work well with the Wife of Bath's Prologue. So somebody have a go, put those two together.
Good, thank you very much. Okay, so Meg, to conclude, what is one bit of advice you would offer to yourself if you could time travel back to when you were studying this for A-level?
The pressure.
Based on everything you know now at university and all the amazing stuff you've studied in Marianne's courses, what is one piece of advice you would give to yourself?
I think probably just to remind yourself, keep reminding yourself that this is a text, that the Wife of Bath and the Pilgrims aren't real. They are constructs. They're created by an author for a reason, and you're studying these texts to find out and speculate about those reasons. So, I think that.
Yeah. And Marianne, if you could give one piece of advice to A-level student who's writing about the Wife of Bath's prologue and tale, what would it be?
Well, I actually think Megan's advice is really great advice. Because everyone really wants to believe that this character she's made to be believable. We really want to believe in her. We want to root for her. But ultimately, we've got to persuade ourselves that she is a textual construct. But I also thought that second great piece of advice was read the footnotes. Absolutely. So you find out so much via the footnotes. You find out what Chaucer's nicked from elsewhere. You find out what he's lying about. You find out what the wife's lying about. You find out so much. The footnotes are your way in to how this text interacts with medieval culture.
And those are the footnotes in the Riverside Chaucer.
Any good edition will have footnotes. I think the Cambridge edition is often recommended at A-level, but Riverside Chaucer has great footnotes, but that's a big, hefty kind of academic tome. But any good edition will have footnotes, so go and lose yourself in them.
Right. So, with the image of losing yourself in the footnotes of Chaucer, we will leave it there. Thank you very much, Marianne, and thank you, Meg.